concerns, your questions. We'll be using that input as we meet and move forward with creating a compensation plan. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Hello. I was going to say howdy, but I didn't know whether that made sense, huh? Not from where I'm at. Anyway, as Jack said, this is a work in process or progress. So there are ideas that we have for some changes and some recommendations, and we have some findings. This is the first time the university has seen these findings. So there were some questions the other day, and so we're going back to make sure that we've got exactly everything right. So this may change. Some of these things may change from this point to going forward. But that's what the purpose of this meeting is to show you what we have at this point in time, bring you up to date, get your comments, concerns, issues, so we can go back and say, hey, did we look at that right? Did we think about that? Do we have all the right numbers, and so on and so forth? So eventually we have to, end this game, this fun that we're having, because we have to go before the Board of Regents and present them with a plan. Well, the committee does. I will guess be the representative for the findings and that we have. So bear with me. Those of you who in the back cannot read this, please come up. Again, as Jack said, this projector is really not very bright, and so we've done whatever we can to make it readable, but there's some type font sizes that just you can't read. I can't read from here. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about where we are, where we've been, and what we're going to talk about today. Give you some overall findings and thoughts that we have, comparing your current pay with the marketplace, and then talk about next steps, where we have to go from here and what we have to do. So with that as an introduction, here's what we were asked to do. We were asked to look at your pay system for all of the support staff, professional administrative, and faculty, so just about everybody that works here. And we were asked to look at the market to identify what the market is doing and compare that to you, to what you're currently being paid, to see whether you're on track, off track. If you're not on track, how far off are you? Are you above, below, or what does it look like? For staff, we used a slightly different process than for faculty. The faculty is pretty straightforward. We look at rank, assistant, associate, full professor, instructor, that sort of thing, and discipline. For staff, we ask you to fill out questionnaires. You all remember that? Wasn't that fun? So we also have to look at the performance evaluation system. We haven't done that yet. So this is just an update on the market. So here's where we've been. Compensation strategy met to identify what your strategy is, where you want to be in relationship to the market, who are your peer groups, how do we want to compare to those peers. Then we sent out those questionnaires, which you all dutifully filled out. We got a lot of them back. Not everybody did. Some people didn't fill it out or didn't want to or lost it or the dog ate it. I don't know. I'll talk about how many we got back. And then we did a market analysis. So we went out, found comparable jobs in similar colleges, other peers, or the local market, depending on the job type, and compared that. So that's what we're talking about today. Performance evaluation, as I said, we haven't started that. The final report, we have not started that either because we need to do some more analysis. So first step was to look at the peers. Now you have in the past used 76 other colleges and universities that you have judged in the past, and they've been used as what we call peer institutions, those which are as comparable as we can get, that we want to match or compare our compensation to. So there were 76 of those. We went through and said, let's just make sure that these make sense. And so we used 3 criteria. We used Carnegie designation, so master's school. We used tuition as another indicator of comparability. And then we used enrollment, student enrollment, as another measure of comparability. Now, we could have had 100 other variables, but these are 3 key variables which we think distinguish one university from another and make them either comparable or not. So on those 3 criteria, if we found that they matched, if those other organizations matched 2 of those, 2 out of those 3, we thought that was a reasonably good match, and we would include that. If they didn't match, then we kind of questioned it. So here's what we found. We grouped them into good matches. We grouped them into aspirational matches. Now, an aspirational college is a college that may be bigger than you are, or grants more degrees, or grants a higher degree level in certain colleges, or some other or maybe their tuition is higher, or they have a slightly different perspective on their educational process than you might. And so they might be those colleges that if you could be like them, you would be like them. You want to be like them. Kind of like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And then there are some matches that we didn't think were necessarily very good. There were 2, Augusta State and Troy University, which morphed into something else during the process that we were looking at. And either they became much bigger or different to the extent that we couldn't figure out what to do with them, so we excluded those by definition. So, see, you can't read that back there, can you? I can't read it here either. But these are, let me just kind of list some of them. These are the schools that we thought were reasonably good matches. So there's, I'm not going to mention names, there are colleges and universities, mostly universities, I guess, in Alabama, North Carolina, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, Kentucky, Louisiana, West Virginia, more Kentucky, some Oklahoma. There's a bunch of Texas schools. So this is all sort of southeast universities. And they were similar on 2 or more of these characteristics of Carnegie, designation, enrollment, or tuition. Okay? So there's I don't know, about 30 of those in, or more in that list. A number of Tennessee schools as well on that list. And then these were aspirational matches. We also included them. There are some Tennessee schools here, but again, same sort of region, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, and so on and so forth, the southeastern part of the U.S. And then these were the ones that we thought, yeah, they might not be the greatest matches because they don't match they don't match 2 of the characteristics like enrollment or Carnegie or whatever, or tuition. Nevertheless, the sum total of all this is that we used 74 of the institutions. Now, for those of you who filled out questionnaires, thank you very much. There were 400 of you who did that out of the 520 or so, I think, employees that could have completed it. So about 80% of those who were supposed to did. And so what we did is we read those to make sure that we understood what the jobs were all about. So we looked at the duties and responsibilities and your education requirements, all of those questions in that questionnaire, if you recall it. We read that several times to make sure that we understood what the job was all about. And that helped us to match the job to the right job in the marketplace. For the jobs that we didn't have questionnaires, we didn't, quite frankly, because we didn't get a questionnaire or any information about that job, we didn't know that they existed. So we only compared those jobs that we knew something about. So we went to find market data, and we normally call these benchmark jobs. These are jobs that we think we can find in other organizations that are performing work in a similar fashion, similar nature and level or difficulty of work, and defined in the same fashion. What we do is we try to match 70% of the duties and responsibilities. So if you've described in your questionnaire 10 things that you do or responsibilities that you have, we said we've got to match 70% of those, or 7 out of those 10, with what the description is in the survey questionnaire, the survey salary survey source. Okay? So that was the criteria. We also wanted to make sure that we had all the different levels, you know, finance, accounting, and counseling, and all of those sorts of things, and all the different levels that we could within those job, families, and occupations. So we collected market data on 192 distinct titles, positions. And we collected the following pieces of information, which I will try to explain when we get there, or I'll explain it several times. We collected data on what's the 25th percentile of the market, what's the 50th percentile, and what's the 75th percentile. So if you think of data as basically a bell curve, the 25th percent says this is where 25% of the organizations pay or less. 25% or less, they pay that or less. 75% level says there's 75% of the organizations that pay at least up to that point, 25% pay higher. So the way to look at that is the 25th percent is, those are the low, if you meet that, you're meeting what the low-paying organizations pay. If you meet the 75th percentile, that's what the high-paying organizations pay. To put it in simpler terms, General Motors is likely to pay at the 75th percentile, but mom and pop's grocery store is probably going to pay at the 25th. The target for most organizations, most of my clients, is the 50th percentile. That's right in the middle. 50% pay more, 50% pay less. Most of the organizations that I deal with are somehow supported by state government or public funds, as you are. And for them, the 50th percentile is the perfect place to be because they're dependent on public tax dollars for their salaries, and they want to be able to attract quality people, but they don't want to pay more than they have to, which would cause concerns among legislators or taxpayers that you are overpaying. So the 50th percentile, while that is the middle point of the distribution of salaries for any particular job, is a good place to be. And it is where most organizations try to target their pay at. So I know that some people would say, well, that's average. We don't want to be average. Most people are average. Most salary systems are based on average data. So you can go to probably 80% of the organizations in Clarksville and say, where do you target your pay? And we say, at the 50th percentile. That's what most organizations do. There's just a handful of organizations that target at a higher level. And then there are some that target at a lower level because they can't afford to pay any higher. So we got data from a variety of sources, and I'm just going to describe each one of these sources in as much detail as I think is necessary. Coupa HR is the College and University Professional Association for HR. They survey every type of job in any college and university throughout the country. They collect data on somewhere upward of 790 or so to 900 different colleges all over the country. So you can tap, and they survey all different jobs: faculty, professional, administrative, support staff. So carpenters, painters, advisors, bursars, financial aid specialists, vice presidents, deans, assistant professors, professors, and so on and so forth. Every job that can be found in a university, they survey. Most of the data we got from them for those peer institutions, those 74 peer institutions. There are some jobs that we could not find data for, or they didn't have enough data in that survey, so we went to some other reputable sources of salary data. Towers Watson, CompData, and Mercer are a couple of them that are up there. Economic Research Institute as well. They either collect surveys that are done or they do their own surveys in private and public sector organizations. So I can go into Towers Watson and say, I need a network specialist. What is a network specialist in this size company? in this kind of industry, what do they get paid on average? Just like I can go into the Coupa database and say, what does a network specialist in other colleges get paid? Then there is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the U.S. government. They do a survey of all different kinds of jobs. In Austin Peay's case, we have used that data for primarily the support staff jobs, the non-exempt, the ones that get paid on an hourly basis, because that represents Tennessee data, and it represents employers in this market. The others represent employers in other states because those peers are in other states. Now, so Coupa was the primary source, but we did augment that with other survey data when we couldn't find a good Coupa match or there was insufficient data. For the support staff, as I indicated, we looked primarily at the Bureau of Labor Statistics because that's more local data. We did some other things. We wanted to make sure that we met the requirements that the Department of Justice spells out that says if you don't have more than 5 participants sharing data, you can't summarize that. So if I have only 4 organizations that reported data on a particular job, I can't share that information with you because that would violate what they say is the Sherman Antitrust Act, where organizations, those 4 organizations, might collude together to determine what ought to be paid. Now, we didn't have any situations where there were less than 5, so we're good there. Now, the numbers that I'm going to show you need to have some perspective. First of all, we compared your salaries for specific 192 jobs, remember, that we had questionnaires for, to the 74 peer institutions or the BLS data, if it was a support job. And so if we show you a plus figure, that means that you're paying more than the middle of the market. If we show you a negative figure, it shows that you're paid less than the middle of the market. And we do this comparison at the 25th, the 50th, which is the middle, and the 75th. Now, a couple of other things you need to keep in mind. We age this. You are well aware that there are different standards of living in different parts of the country. So if we got data from another part of the country, we wanted to make sure that it was reflective of this cost of labor and cost of living here in Clarksville. Actually, we heard a lot of feedback that says, you know, a lot of our people live in Nashville or just on the outskirts of Nashville and drive here every day. So we ought to consider both Nashville and Clarksville. So we took a happy median in between, because there is a difference between the cost of living and cost of labor in Nashville from Clarksville. So we took a happy medium between those two. We also aged the market data up to January 1st of 2016 because when we get to the Board of Regents, it's going to be 2016. Another thing that you need to be aware is when you see these figures, we put a boundary around the numbers. And this says if you are within plus or minus 5% of what the market is, we consider that highly competitive. If you're within plus or minus 10% of the market, you are considered competitive. Anything beyond that, and we have probably some issues to deal with. Now, why is this relevant? Because sometimes I hear from clients that say, well, the market's the market. We ought to get paid with the market. The market changes. The market changes daily. People get fired, people leave, people quit, people get promoted. Every day that market number fluctuates. Just like people quit here, get promoted, leave, retire, whatever. And so the data here changes as well. So given this little cushion of plus or minus 5%, if you look within that corridor and say anything within that plus or minus 5% is reasonably highly competitive, that's the perspective you need to have. Now, I understand that's a 10% shift, and if you got a 10% increase, you'd be happy, right? It'd be 25% would be even better, but 10% you'll take it, right? If forced into a corner. No? Okay, good. But you got to put it in this perspective of numbers. So here we go. Support staff. This is the number you want to look at. This is the middle of the market. You're down by about 7.6% from the middle of the market. Your salaries compared to the market, to the middle of the market, you're down 7.6. Those administrative professionals are better, down, but they're still down 2.9%. So the way to interpret this is, well, here's the way policymakers will interpret this, because I think you need to understand how policymakers are going to look at this. They're going to look at the 7.6% and say, okay, we're competitive. Maybe we're not as competitive as we want to be, but we're not a total disaster. And when they look at the 2.9%, they're going to say, okay, we're better there, so let's try to maintain that, and if we can improve it, let's try to do that. But just among those two groups, we ought to focus on those that are worst off. I mean, if I had money, that's how I'd do it. I'd say, let's focus on the ones that are worst off first and get them up a little closer to where we think we ought to be. Now, this is a composite number of all the 192 jobs, so this is an average number. And with all averages, there's going to be some fluctuation. There's going to be some jobs that are quote unquote over that, and you might say they're overpaid, but I'm not, that's a inflammatory word. And there's some that are grossly underpaid in relationship to that 50th percentile. So this is an average. What I don't want you to take out of this is this. Do not think that if this gets approved, everybody gets a 7.6% raise. That is the wrong conclusion. I don't really know. But this is overall, if you look at how much money we're spending for all of you in this room and all of the people that aren't here, we need 7.6% more for the support staff and 2.9% more for the professionals to put them right on the middle of the market. Now, there could be some fluctuations because of seniority. Maybe some of you just got here. This is your first job at Austin Peay. Some of you have been here forever, and so you ought to be higher than the newcomer, right? All of those things play into account here to get to this 7.6 or 2.9. Now, here's, I guess, the good news. You're above the 25th percentile. So let's put that in different language. You're getting paid better than the worst payers in the market. Somebody's got to spin it. But you're getting paid worse than the best payers. Okay, I mean, that's just simple numbers. Where are you in relationship to where you ought to be as a state institution, as a college of this size or a university of this size, in this state, in this market? That's where you should be. Some people would say, well, average. We don't want to be average. You know, it's like Wobegon. Everybody's above average. If everybody's above average, then that is the new average. Now, faculty, any random faculty members find this meeting? Okay, great. Unfortunately, the numbers aren't as positive for you. So again, the 50th percentile, this is a cross-discipline. So we've got instructor, assistant, associate, professor, and if I'm looking at the 50th percentile, instructors are down 16%, assistants 19%, associates and professors are at 10% and 11% respectively. So across that group of ranks, it's 11.06. Now, given our guidelines that plus or minus 10% is competitive, we're outside the bounds on just about every rank of faculty. So you're outside the competitive market. Should I spin this too? You're paying lower than the worst payers, and you're really not comparable to the highest payers. So the trend here is pretty similar. The staff are a little bit better in terms of pay than the faculty. But again, this is across disciplines. You've got a number of different disciplines. This is just by rank. We've done that analysis by discipline and rank, so there's more detail under that. But this is just simply the summary data. Okay, so where do we go from here? What do we do with this information, and how do we make sense of it to put it into an action plan that we can take to the board, that we can get hopefully approved, that we can then translate into on-campus changes and decisions? So we were asked to take the support staff structure of grades and ranges and say, don't change that because we're comfortable with how that internal equity is. But tell us whether, in fact, given the market data, we ought to move people to a different grade based on the market data. And so we did that, and there would be a number of changes if that were implemented. Some jobs would go up in grade, some jobs might go down in grade. Would that affect your pay? No. If you went down, no. If you went up, maybe. Okay? So there's a lot of things that you have to consider when you make that mathematical calculation. Does it make internal equity sense? In other words, let's say that we have a carpenter 1, 2, and 3, and the carpenter 1 should be paid at the carpenter 2 level, but yet you've had a 1, 2, and 3, and you want to retain that for promotional purposes. You're not going to move the 1 up to the grade 2 because you want to retain that promotional opportunity. Okay? For the professional jobs, you've got a 13 skill-based grade structure, and the university wanted to go to completely market-based. So if you're a financial aid counselor, you would be compared to financial aid counselors, not to other jobs within a particular skill level or grade level. So we would look at those other colleges and say, yep, that's what they pay, that's what your market is for your job. So back to the support staff structure. So if we did that, if we looked at the market and said, is it in the right grade based on the market, we said, where's the market and what's the closest midpoint of the current structure? Let's put it in that grade. And once we've got them in that grade, we have to ask the question, does that mean they change grades? Do they go up, down, or do they stay the same? So that was the technique that we used. And there are a number of jobs that are misaligned when you look at that market data in comparison to your current salary structure. So there would be some changes if the university decides to implement those changes. With regard to, this slide doesn't mean a heck of a lot right now. So before that occurs, we would suggest that the university make sure that that makes sense internally. So even though we've gone through the math and made certain conclusions based on the math, you always have to introduce the human element and say, does this really make sense for managing pay for employees now and in the future? And so that always takes another perspective, another look at the clear, look at market data. Now, university asked us to take a look at the salary plan. We said basically it's well constructed, it's logical, it makes some sense. It has tended to be a little rigid in its application, and so perhaps there are some issues about transparency and understanding that need to be clarified. So we approached that to identify a better, more transparent way to manage pay. And so here's what we have suggested: that professional and support staff pay ought to be related to two things: the market and the years of experience that you have. So if you hire somebody from the outside with no experience in that field, they would get paid 76% of that market middle point, that 50th percentile. Okay? And then over a 3 to 6, over a 6-year period of time, they would get increases so that at the end of the 6th year, assuming that there's sufficient money, you would be at the middle point of the market. In other words, the middle of the market, that 50th percentile. So there would be a progression from that point. Now, if you came in with, say, 5 years of experience in that job, so you're hired in with 5 years of experience, you may be given a higher rate of pay equivalent to somebody who has 5 years of experience at Austin Peay and paid accordingly. There may be some occasions where somebody comes in with a great deal of experience, and it would be prudent to pay them at a higher level than that market middle point. And if that were the case, we think that it would be appropriate to have an administrative oversight, kind of a chain of command, to make sure that that makes sense for the university, and we haven't caused any additional problems in terms of pay compression or pay relationships with existing employees. So that's essentially that recommendation for placing new employees and monitoring the employee pay in future years. After they reach the target, after you reach that middle point of your salary based on the market, and if there are any additional dollars left over that can be used for adjustments, then we would suggest that a certain formula be used to make sure that that distribution of money is equitable. And so we've just, I don't really tend to go through this formula, but we're basically suggesting that there should be an objective way to make sure that the money is distributed fairly among the people, if there is remaining dollars. And basically this would apply to those people that are already at the middle point of their job, that middle point of that market for their job. There would be a merit pay. If your performance on merit was less than acceptable, in other words, you got there but your performance isn't so good, you would get nothing in terms of additional merit pay. If your performance was outstanding, you would get that prorated amount, that fair amount, plus some additional percentage. So you would get more. This would apply only if there is additional money available to be distributed. So that's the recommended formula. We have yet to go to the performance evaluation system and look at it and adjust that and accommodate the changes that we think would make it a good objective system to be tied to pay. But that's the thought concept that we're working with at this point. Now, so at 6 years, you would be paid at the middle point of the market rate for your job. Going forward, employees would be able to be paid above the midpoint based on performance. So in other words, in other terms, if you come into Austin Peay with no experience in the job, within 6 years you will be at the market rate for your job. And then anything beyond that would be based on performance. So you're kind of guaranteed that you'll get to the market rate. And then beyond that is up to you and your performance. There would be a maximum. In other words, you can't be paid more than 125% or 24% of that market middle point. So at some point in time, there is a cap. Now, everybody has a cap except one state that I'm aware of, state of Alaska. So if you don't want to be capped, go to the state of Alaska, because they will continue to increase your pay until you retire or die in the job. So you can be paid $100,000 or $150,000 for whatever job there might be if you stick around long enough. So you could be paid $150,000 if you're a carpenter or a plumber. All right, for faculty, we're recommending a slightly simplified system because we understand that's a fairly complex system since there's only one faculty member here that admitted they were faculty, 2 now. But Jack, I've talked to you before, so this is not you've seen this. So we think your pay rate ought to be based on the market, just like the staff, but also your, what's called your discipline, or your, what Coupa calls the CIP code, and years of experience. So those two, it's common then between the two systems, whether it's faculty or staff. There's a slight difference though, because faculty have kind of an automatic rank system, and if you're a tenure track faculty, you generally come in as an assistant, you move up to associate, tenure occurs somewhere along the path, and then you're a full professor. So we have some recommendations here that you would, if you're an assistant professor brought in with no experience, you would be 3 years to get to that middle point of your rank and discipline. If you're an associate, it would take you an additional 5 years, to get to your middle point of your rank and discipline, and then if you're a full professor, an additional 10 years. Now, we've also provided for thought, because this is a foreign concept to faculty in most institutions, but we also get a lot of resonance when we talk to faculty, and that is we think there ought to be some flexibility about where that median is of the market. And based on performance, we think there should be some flexibility. We thought the 5% flexibility between 97.5 and 102.5% of the market median would represent a reasonable amount of flexibility, not much, but some flexibility for recognizing those professors by rank and discipline and years of experience that maybe have exceeded performance expectations or exceeded the performance that you might expect for that rank and discipline. Again, there would be a cap at 124% of that market median. So for non-tenured, there as instructors, we've got the same kind of formula, but 6 years. Now, we just had a couple of examples for faculty. You could apply this to staff, although we didn't. And that is, so the hiring with employees with no teaching experience would be hired at the 76% of that market middle point, just like staff is recommended. Every additional year of teaching would get an increase so that within those period of time, people would be by rank and discipline at their market middle point. And if anybody is brought in above that middle point because of previous experience or outstanding qualifications or whatever, there's a variety of reasons where that might occur, there would have to be an additional review process. So we took a faculty member and said, well, what would happen if we hired an associate professor of math with 4 years of prior experience? CIP code is 2701, so we go out to the Coupa database and find out what's that market median for those jobs among our peers, and we find that it's 62,823. The range minimum is 76% of that, and this person has 4 years of experience, so we're going to add 4.5% or 4.5% per year to get to 18%. So we add those two together to get 94% of the market median. So bingo, here's what they get paid, $59,094. And basically another year or two and they would be at that middle point. We did another one, although I understand nobody has ever been hired as a full professor here, straight out of the woodwork. But same concept, full professor, 10 years of experience, CIP code of 4201, the 50th percentile is 106, 380. Got 10 years of experience, so you add all of that information together. We can pay up to 102.5% of the market median because of that flexibility of performance. And so we come in at 102.5% of the market median would be 109, which is that 102 of the market median, 106. Okay, so where do we go from here? There have been some changes in the market or what you have been paid. Some jobs have been adjusted and we may not have pulled that accurate data. So we're going to check that to make sure that we've got the accurate data, because when we go to the board, we want to make sure that we're dead on accurate for a particular point in time at least. And the most recent point in time should be now. Then we have to make sure that any grade changes, that's accurate based on the data, because if the data changes, the grade change findings might change. We need to identify whether there's any changes to the compensation plan itself in terms of hiring rate, progression, that sort of thing. Is there a way to make this as simple as possible, as transparent as possible, and yet be fair and objective to all employees? And then we have to figure out what it's going to cost to move into the recommended pay levels. Now, let us say that the cost is enormous. And we go to the board and they say, well, we can't afford enormous, we can afford half of enormous. Then we can go back and say, okay, here's how we're going to implement based on this restriction. But the formula that we built to transition in terms of implementation will be fair across the board. So everybody will be treated to the same criteria. So that's the near term. The long term is a couple of things. We have to look at the performance evaluation process to see whether that can be beefed up, made a little more objective, a little tighter, so that it can be used for distribution of merit pay. We need to prepare a final report and go before the board for their blessing or blasting, whatever the case may be. Hopefully it'll be blessing. In the future, in order to maintain this on an objective and fair fashion, we suggest that you update the structure by a trend factor, how much the market is moving. And you can do that for about 3 to 4 years before you then ought to step back and do a more thorough analysis of your peer group and all of the jobs that we've matched here. Because sometimes job families move ahead. I don't know if you were around when Y2K emerged, but all of a sudden legacy programmers, their salaries skyrocketed over a 2 or 3 year period of time, and then after Y2K they slammed down again. So you want to make sure that you capture those kinds of structural changes in the market. So now, questions about the study, questions about the process. We've got the two co-chair of the committee here, and they are here to answer or clarify or take your questions as well. So anything is reasonably available for discussion. Yes?
I have 2 questions.
We're going to wander back with a microphone so everybody else can hear you. So if you have a question, if you can wait till that microphone gets to you.
Okay, hi. 2 questions. One is when in regards to the pay that's focusing on that's compared to the market, do you take into consideration like the education level that's required for the specific position?
Yeah, so when we look at matching jobs, we look at what's the educational level or requirement, not educational level of the incumbents, but what's the requirement to hold that position, and what do you require here, and what does the market establish? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is based on the performance and merit base. So you won't be able to be compensated based on your performance until after your 6 years here?
That's the concept that we're floating out now, yes.
Okay.
So put that in another way, I'll put it in very crude terms. Sometimes people understand those crude terms. If you get hired here, we want to guarantee that you'll get to the market midpoint. After that, it's up to you. But we will try to get you to the market middle point, a competitive rate of pay.
Okay, so these ranges that you have the different support staff in, are you going to release that data, or is it available to look at? Because you said that some were in a different grade, or however you want to, I'm not sure how you said
Yeah,
that.
well,
but-
right now, we're not going to release it because we're still making sure that it's accurate. I mean, the last thing you want to do is have inaccurate data floating around, creating rumor and misinformation on campus. So I don't know when it will be released. Obviously, when it goes to the board, it becomes public information at that point in time, and it has to be released because it's a public document. When it's released before that is not my decision to make. I can counsel the committee on when is it appropriate and when it isn't. But even though it's released and you look at the data, if the board decides not to do a thing, it's nice information to have. It helps start fires at night.
And also, somebody had asked me, this was going to be taped, correct? For other people to view, yes or no? Was this going to be
what?
video recorded for others?
This, I think, is taped, yes, so
Okay.
you can watch it over and over again.
And the presentation will be available?
Yes,
It's going to be on?
Yes.
And then somebody asked me when it was going to be available. Do you know?
that I don't have the answer to.
I'm assuming.
Probably at the end of this week, I would guess. Yes. Okay, so the question is what time period we're thinking of the implementation. I don't have an answer to that because we have to identify the appropriate cost. Once we know what the end cost would be to get to everybody to a certain point based on their market and their years of service in that job, then we can come back and say, or the board will actually come back and say, yep, we can afford it. That would be wonderful news. Or no, we can't afford all of it. We need to split it up into 2 or 3 years. Usually when I get to this point with a client, I say if you're going to split it up over a couple of years, don't go longer than 3. Because at the end of the 3rd year, or maybe even during the 3rd year, somewhere someone will say, haven't we addressed this problem a couple of years ago? And then new priorities will emerge. You know how that goes. So there are other options. I mean, I had a college, well, it was a part of a system that said, we can't afford that. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the 40% of employees that are the worst off. In other words, they're paid the lowest in comparison to where they should be. And we're going to dedicate most of the money to them in the 1st year. The 2nd year, we'll devote it to the others. So that was their approach. Come on, I know you got a question in there. Yes, sir. Oh, so the question was, if educational degrees don't necessarily place you in a certain spot in the range, right? Will there be some consideration for that?
Well, no, like, so like if somebody, like the position requires a bachelor.
Yep.
And someone has a master's.
Yep.
Doesn't get the more, but then the bachelor's person gets their master's, they still get the 4 to 6% education.
Is that what happens now? Yeah, so, you know, my college clients, half do that and half don't. The ones that don't want to, the ones that do are fine with it. And usually it's, yeah, we want you to be at the minimum of what's required, and then if you get some additional education, it's got to, you know, meet all these requirements and all that kind of stuff, and you got to pass the score, the classes, and then there's usually a fixed dollar amount that stays the same. Now, I don't know how that works here, but they'll say, yeah, you'll get $1,500 more for this degree, or $2,000 for this degree, that sort of thing. And that never changes. It's an add-on. Yeah. I mean, you're a university, for God's sake. You ought to value education as long as it meets certain requirements, like it's related to your field, it'll help you in your job and that sort of thing. I mean, I wouldn't want you, if you're an accountant, to go out and get a degree in geology to take a subject. I mean, yeah, you may be a more educated person, but how's that going to add to the value of your job at this university? Yes, sir?
Is the Coupa data based on 6 years of experience for the market?
The Coupa data is based on whatever current employees are paid, and they could be paid more or less than that middle of the market. That's how we get to the middle. So a lot of times, quite frankly, when you look at a salary range, you have a minimum and a maximum. When I go into clients, I find out that if they're hired at the minimum, and then next year they give everybody across the board raise, and they raise the salary range, that person's still at the minimum. And they may do this for 12, 15 years, so they could still be at the minimum of the salary range, but because they've moved and the salary range has moved, they haven't really moved relative to their salary range. So I find a lot of that. So what does that mean for the Coupa data? It means that we've taken actual salary data of employees. I don't know what their average tenure or seniority in their job is. They don't report that. They don't collect that data. You have to assume that there's a distribution, some that have just joined, some that have been there forever, just like here. That's why that 5% corridor helps to put numbers in perspective. Jack or Jack? Oh, you have another question?
I have another question. I know there's not a deadline to, or a time period that you want Austin to like incorporate this plan, but is there a time that you guys plan to present, or a deadline that you plan on having like all the research and the data analysis completed?
Yeah, I suspect that will be sometime in the middle to late January, because we have to go to the board in March. I don't know when exactly that date is, but there's got to be a lot of vetting by the president and this, you know, the cabinet and all of that sort of thing to make sure we got the right words, saying the right things in the right spots. So I suspect it's that time period. But on the other hand, until you walk into the board meeting, that thing isn't final. Until you open your mouth, it's still a draft.
And the compensation committee is an advisory committee, so we only advise the president to do whatever she wants with her own.
Any final comments from the co-chairs?
Feel free to email us anything, any concerns you have during the board.
No, the email that was sent out to notify you of the presentations had the list of all the committee members. So you can email anybody on the list. Or if you don't feel comfortable emailing, send it to your coworker. They might feel comfortable emailing. Or just call. So. I think that's it. If there are no other questions.
Thank you very much.